Hello, everyone. Yeah, you can go. I have kiddos driving their tractors around, so I'm trying to just clear out so that it's not so loud and noisy. Hello, everyone. This is going to be recorded. So if you have any questions, those questions will be recorded. If you're not able to join, or if you have to pop out at any time, just know that this will be available to watch after the fact. So don't feel like you have to be crazy writing down notes or anything of that nature. First of all, welcome. I would like to test out the chat. So if anyone could type something into that chat box just to make sure that I am seeing messages and questions as we go, I'd appreciate that. I'm going to type something to you all. Hey, perfect. Thank you, Stephanie. All right. Looks like the chat is working. Thanks, Amber. Perfect. Okay, so as you have questions, please feel free to pop them into that chat box as we're going, and I will try to check over there periodically and look at those questions. So it's a beautiful morning. It is fall here for us. Just to give you guys some context of where we are zone 5-6. And so our average first frost is usually mid-October. So I just like to put that into framework context for you guys to know where we are at in our season. Some of you might have later frosts, some might have early frosts. The great thing about this class is that it's going to be the same treatment of the garden and of the soil, regardless of your zone and regardless of your soil type. The only thing that's going to change a little bit is going to be the timing of when you do these things. So part of the class is a seasonal guide and what to do when. And I just wanted to give you guys the fall version of that because the class isn't getting released until November. I wanted to make sure that you have this framework so that you can get started with the fall piece of it. So I wanted to start off by talking a little bit about cover crops. Now, these are our raised beds. Regardless of what soil you're using, whether you're doing a raised bed, whether you're doing in-ground growing, or if you're doing containers, all of these can be treated the same way. So don't worry about that piece of it. This is a bed that we have not had a chance to cover crop. I actually did put a cover crop seed in here. It might germinate. It's been in for about 4 days. Oh, actually, I see one just starting to germinate, but we're going to start by talking about that cover crop piece of it. Toward the end, we're going to be talking about what to do if you don't have a chance to cover crop. Okay. So cover cropping is the most important thing is the timing. And this is a question that I know a few of you had submitted to me before this in terms of I don't have time to get my garden bed cleaned up and get a cover crop in. So we're going to look at that. I have a question, Laura, how do you balance leaving flowers for pollinators? So yeah, we'll talk about that. But in general, I like to leave any perennial flowers or perennial plants. I'm going to take off my hat so you can see. There we go. I'm going to leave any perennials in place. So these are mostly annual garden beds. However, you might have annual and perennial scattered throughout. I like to leave things that are going to feed the birds. And as you'll learn in the class, the birds are a really important part of the garden aspect and the ecosystem. So we definitely want to make sure that we're providing food for those birds as the winter goes on. So definitely leave things that have seed heads that you want to reseed. If there are things that you don't want to reseed, I would remove those. So for example, carrot, which can become actually somewhat invasive in your garden bed, fennel, which can do the same thing. Those seed heads I will remove just because I don't want them becoming a mess in the spring. But in general, perennial things, the native plants especially, are great to leave in place for the birds. But this is a bed that we haven't gotten a chance to cover crop. But what I want to show you is how to clean up at the end of the year. So we're going to start there. And the most important thing, I've left a couple. This is a really sad tomato that never really did very well. It got planted out at the wrong time. But when we're cleaning up our garden bed in the fall, the first thing that you're going to want to do is start removing any plants that were dead or diseased or had any issues. So this one is actually pretty healthy, but let's say that this tomato had blight, then we would want to remove that plant. If it had powdery mildew, then you want to remove any leaves that are above the soil level. Take them out of your garden. Don't compost them at all because powdery mildew can get spread into the soil and you can put it back into your garden for the next year. That's never a good thing. So in general, what we want to be doing is actually breaking off our plants right at the base and just removing the top growth. This is true for most things that I'm growing here in the garden, again, unless they had a root affecting disease. Powdery mildew does not affect the roots. So what happens if we pull the plants out of the soil at the end of the year is we end up removing a lot of this organic matter that was already existing in the soil. You can see that here. We'll pull out, even though these plants were not very healthy. So this is why these root systems are nothing to write home about, okay? They're not super impressive. However, they are organic matter. So when we're talking about soil life, and this is all part of the class, so don't panic or worry if you don't know what I'm talking about, but all of this soil life is existing within this part of the plant, the rhizosphere. And if we start to remove this, then we're removing a lot of that soil life, and we want to keep that in place as long as possible. I'll show you over here with some plants that had a more robust root system. This was some kale, and usually you can see what I do. I just cut them right off here. But if I pull them out, you can see how much I'm removing from the soil. This is all organic matter. There's mycorrhiza, these little tiny root hairs here. All of this soil life is existing within this realm right here. So removing this is not a good thing. We want to leave that in the soil all winter. Now in the spring, for most of our annual plants, those roots are going to be mostly gone. They break down, the soil life eats them over the winter. All of our shredders and decomposers are going to eat those roots too. So you're really not left with much in the spring, except for a little bit of root. You'll have something like this left in the spring, and you can just plant around that. It's really not a big deal, but leaving the roots in the ground is important in the fall. All right, I have another question about compost heap. How many seasons it'll take to break down once you get started? It depends. We do cover that in the class. It depends on how often you're turning your compost. If you're turning your compost often, it's going to be ready more quickly. All right. So let's talk now that we've gotten, so let's say that we're at this point in the season, we have cut down our most of our plants. This is where a concept called undercropping comes into play. What should you do about weeds? I remove weeds. I don't like to deal with weeds the next year. I know that weeds are part of biodiversity, but they're not necessarily a piece of biodiversity that I always want in my garden bed. And so I personally will remove weeds in the fall. And those ones I do pull up from the root so that they're not regrowing in the spring. Good question. Thanks, Stephanie. She asked, what do we do about weeds in the garden bed in the fall? Remove them. I would. So now that we've gotten most of our plants cut down, and I was just mentioning undercropping. So cover cropping is a concept that we go into in class, and there's also a guide to cover crops that's a written guide that's going to come with that. But what I want to tell you now is timing of cover crops. So cover crop timing is complicated for home garden beds. And what I tell people is to get used to a concept called undercropping. And undercropping, yeah, we'll talk about foliage and keeping the garden bed blanketed, Allison. But what I want to talk about is undercropping. So undercropping is just the concept of cover cropping, but under existing plants. So let's look at this, and I'm going to hope my internet doesn't give out as I walk over here. But let's look at it in practice. So this is the best way for you as a home gardener to implement a cover crop strategy while still being able to grow plants in your garden bed. So over here, this is a bed where we have several things going on. We have chives here. We have leeks here. What else do we have? We have some rose geranium still over there. And we actually still have some beans growing up here. So what we've done in this bed is a concept called undercropping. You can see our cover crop is here. This is our cover crop that we planted to establish for the winter. So what we did in this bed was undercropping. So undercropping, what I do is toward the end of summer. Usually for me, because I said our first frost is usually early mid-October, I go through in late August or early September. I cut down all of the plants that either I'm no longer using, are not producing well, or just, don't look very healthy anymore. And I cut those down at the root so that there's some sunlight getting to the soil level. Then I go ahead and undercrop. So once you have some access to the soil and some light, you can go ahead and crop your cover crop right into your existing garden bed. So you do not have to wait to remove everything from your garden in order to put in a cover crop. So I hope that makes sense. And that's something that we talk about in the class and we do show how to do. But we've also done where we've removed a lot of the foliage. So we've taken off a lot of these leaves for these beans so that that sunlight can get down and help this cover crop germinate. So let's talk about cover crops a little bit more in depth. Again, we do go over a lot of this stuff in class, but I want to give you guys the framework since you purchased the class heading into fall. So things to consider with cover crops. If you have 3 or 4 weeks before your first frost, you still have time to cover crop. If you're like me and your first frost is probably going to be coming up this week, yes, you can still cover crop, but not with the cover crops that I like to use. So at this stage in the season, the cover crops you're going to be using if you're close to your first frost are going to be ones that have to grow over the winter. They're going to be able to germinate and grow in cold temperatures. The problem with those is that they grow over cold temperatures, and in the spring, they start regrowing vigorously. And then sometimes you have a problem on your hands because you always want to think about termination with cover crops. Termination for cover crops is just a blanket term for killing cover crops. So we don't want these to ever go to seed. Okay, we never want our cover crop to go to seed because it's going to create a big mess in your garden bed if you all of a sudden have a bunch of not weed seeds, but cover crop seeds growing and dropping on your soil. Then you're going to be battling it, and you don't want that. So we never want it to go to seed. So this is why we're thinking about termination of our cover crop. So when we're thinking about termination of our cover crop, I like to personally myself, and this is why the recommended blend we give you in the class is a winter kill cover crop. That means it's going to die on its own over winter in most zones in the US. Now, if you're in a zone 9 or 10, those crops might not terminate, and you're going to have to tarp them to kill them. We are going to talk about that in the class. We're not going to go over it today because that's part of spring and winter. So don't panic if you don't know what I'm saying. We show you exactly how to do it. But thinking about the termination is key. So for these crops, I know that these are ones that are going to winter kill. So about 4 weeks before my first frost, I planted these in, sprinkled with a little bit of dirt, kept it moist until they germinated, and now they've been growing. Once we hit cold winter temperatures, these are all going to die back. And what we'll be left with is a nice blanket over the soil. This will just die down, and it's just going to sit just like this on top of the soil. It's also, remember we mentioned the rhizosphere at the beginning of this live. It's going to be feeding the rhizosphere over the winter and keeping the soil life alive. The reason we want to keep the soil life alive is because we're cutting back on fertilizers. So in our class, we mentioned you do not have to use fertilizers anymore if you're using this method. The reason is because we're feeding the soil life, and the soil life is what's making those nutrients available to the plant. So we're not having to use those fertilizers. So that's a little bit about the timing of cover crops. Again, if you don't have a few weeks before your first frost, it's probably too late. So we're going to show you what to do if you didn't have a chance to get a cover crop in your garden bed. Will the class have more information about powdery mildew? Yes and no. We don't give the answers in the class to every single disease, every single fungus. That's really not, there's too many things to be able to encompass in an hour and a half class. However, we go about talking about things like biodiversity, things like companion planting, things like spreading out your planting so that if you do get powdery mildew, it doesn't infect all of your other plants. Powdery mildew is an issue pretty much regardless of where you are in the United States. Usually it has to do with spacing. It has to do with circulation, air circulation, and it also just has to do with general health of plants. So when we're talking about the health of plants and the health of soil, having a healthier soil is always going to be helpful with things like funguses and diseases and powdery mildew. So I hope that helps. All right, so yes, Kara had a question. Can you cover your beds with mulch leaves instead? So now that I've talked a little bit about cover cropping, most of you probably don't have a cover crop in right now. Now, you can do a cover crop in this spring if you want to, but you're always going to have that termination piece in mind. How am I going to kill the cover crop? And when we're talking about doing a spring cover crop, you'll either need to turn it under using a tiller, or you'll have to tarp it in order to kill that in the spring, and you'll have to do it 2 to 4 weeks before you plant. So spring cover cropping is a little bit more complicated. It's not something that we really recommend doing in the class just because I find for home gardens, it doesn't work that well. We really recommend this method of undercropping in the fall, and that's why that's what we talked about today. All right, so let's look at how to prep if you didn't have a chance to cover crop. So we'll go back over to this bed that did not have a cover crop in it. And our sheep are, every time I come over here, they think I'm going to give them treats. That's why they're yelling at me. I'm just reading these questions. Rye says, I'm currently cleaning up a bed that was taken over by weeds. As I'm pulling the weeds, I hear all the seeds scattering. What can I do at this point? Yeah, so if you have weed seeds, weeds that have gone to seed, I often like to have a tarp nearby, or you can even take bags and bag the heads as you're removing those weeds so that they aren't dropping weeds all over the place. At this point, if they've already dropped weeds, you can solarize, but you really have to do solarizing in the warmer part of the season. So you really can't solarize in the cold part of winter. It's not going to work that well. But what you can do is tarp your bed. And by tarping your bed, it's going to help keep those weed seeds from germinating in the spring until it's time to plant. But if you can, try to encapsulate those weeds as you're removing them from your bed. All right, so let's come back to this bed here. So let's say this is probably what most of our beds are going to look like when we've cut down most of our annual plants. Now, again, anything that's perennial, you can leave. I actually am going to leave these leeks because I like these, the flowers that these make in the spring. They make a really pretty nice big white flower. And I'm going to show you how to treat this soil. So what we're going to need is some good compost. So we've got a nice high quality compost here. This is our homemade compost. We'll talk about things to think about in your compost at the end of the demonstration. And we're also going to have some leaf mulch that I thought Savannah was grabbing for me, but she might not have seen that text. So here's my bare soil. We don't want to leave it bare over winter. And the reason for that is because we want to make sure that we're keeping the moisture in the soil and that we're keeping the soil temperatures as even as we can. So if we start having a lot of temperature fluctuations in the soil, that's detrimental to the soil life that is existing within the soil. That's going to help us mineralize nutrients and keep from having to use as many fertilizers. So since we have this exposed soil, we want to bury that for the winter. There's a couple of steps I like to do. So I'm going to show you two things I like to do. One is apply compost. Don't over apply compost. Okay. I'm seeing this all over everything. Everyone recommending compost. And then they put it on and it's this huge, deep pile of compost. That is too much compost. There is such thing as too much of a good thing. And that is definitely true with compost. Overuse of compost can lead to excessive phosphorus levels, which can lead to iron issues in your plants and general nutrient deficiencies. So using too much compost is not a good thing. Too much of a good thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a sprinkle. Let's zoom in on the soil level here. Yes, those are soaker hoses. We use drip irrigation here. So you can see I'm not doing a very thick layer of compost. Now, if this is your first year working in a bed and you've just broken ground on some of your soil, you can do a little bit thicker layer, but in general, I do about a ½ an inch maybe. Okay, it does not have to be a huge thick pile of mulch or of compost on top of your soil. You can see this is really not that much. So I start there. After I have applied that compost, I like to come in with my broad fork, or you can use a pitchfork. So a broad fork is just basically a bigger version of this. It has a little bit thicker tines. And this is an option that you can use in these beds if you don't have a broad fork. Broad forks can be expensive, like $300. We do show you how to use one in the class, but a pitchfork will work as well. So I'm doing this because I want to help get a little bit of this compost down into the soil. But I don't want to turn over my soil too much and disturb it. So I've applied my good compost on top. I'm going to pull this pitchfork back just slightly so you can see how there's starting to be some cracks right here on the surface of the soil. And that compost that we just applied is starting to work its way down into those cracks and fill it in. That's helping with aeration. So our soil life does need a little bit of oxygen down in here. And it's also, again, helping get some of that compost down into those cracks which is going to help get organic matter down and worked into the soil. That's all I do. You don't have to do a big turn. Just crack it back slightly after you've applied that little bit of compost. That little bit of compost is going to help, again, with organic matter over the winter, and it's going to help with aeration. Oh, and look at that giant worm that just, look at this guy, just popped up out of there. Oh, that's a big guy. So this is why we don't want to till, because broad forking will still keep these guys alive. See how many wormies are in there? So broad forking will not kill the worms like tilling will. Worms are a sign of good soil. They are not a fix for bad soil. But don't worry, we talked about that in the class too. All right, so now that we've done that, now we're going to blanket it. So we mentioned that we want to keep moisture in the soil, and we also want to keep the soil temperatures even. So in order to do that, we want to have some kind of a blanket on top of the soil. Now, if you had time to get a cover crop in, that cover crop is serving. Get back in there, you little, look at this guy, he's huge. That cover crop is serving as your blanket for the soil if you were able to get that cover crop in. If not, leaves are my favorite next option. Okay, so put up a sign in your front yard that says, we'll take your leaves. I often get questions about what kind of leaves. Can I use oak leaves? Can I use cottonwood? Can I use, all these different things? In general, I find as long as I have a nice diverse mix of leaves, nothing has ever been a bad type of leaf to use. Some people will say don't use black walnut because they have allelopathic properties, which means they can keep plants from growing. As long as you have a mix of leaves that you're applying to your bed, you don't have to worry about that stuff. Now, I don't like to mulch the leaves before I apply them, and that's because we often have a lot of beneficials in the leaves themselves. So we talk in the class quite a bit about ecosystems and how the garden has to function as an ecosystem for all of this to work, for the pesticide reduction to work, for the disease prevention to work. We need that ecosystem. And if we mulch the leaves, we are often destroying a lot of the cocoons, the eggs, the larvae that are actually using those leaves as a home over the winter. So I like to leave them whole and put them over the top of the bed. I do a layer about this thick, 2 to 3 inches of leaves on top. And then what I like to do is apply something to hold it down. So you can use a tarp, you can use mesh, like some kind of a wire mesh, or you can use netting, insect netting if you have netting, just to hold those leaves in place. Because if you're like me and you have a windy fall, look at just in time. If you have a windy fall, then those leaves can blow away. So let's just look at what that looks like and how thick I put them on. Savvy and Dawn just rolled up with those leaves. Would rye and clover work well together for a cover crop? You need to think about your termination. Thanks, ladies. So if you're thinking about termination, rye and clover are difficult ones to kill. And that's why clover can be a bit of a aggressive plant in the lawn. For example, people overseed with clover because it spreads well, which is a great thing in a grass lawn, but not such a great thing in your garden bed. Rye can also become very grass-like, and it will grow over winter. So when we talked about termination, and I like ones that will terminate over the winter, rye and clover will often start regrowing in the spring. There's a couple different variations of clover, but in general. So you'll have to think about termination. So you're going to have to do one of two things. Probably you'll have to either till it in, or you're going to have to spray it with some kind of herbicide to kill it. Neither of those things are particularly things that I want to do with my garden bed personally. We talk about tilling in the class as a way to establish a garden bed the first time, but after that, annual tillage is usually not the best. So rye and clover can work in certain situations. I just don't like the termination opportunities with those particular cover crops. So we do give you a cover crop mix in the class. I can tell you now if you want to know what it is. It is peas, buckwheat, radish, and oats. And there are reasons behind each of those that we do discuss in the class. We talk about why we use each one. Oats is a catch crop. Peas is a nitrogen fixer. Radish is good for breaking up compaction, and buckwheat is a really quick germinator. So when we're trying to get a nice cover shaded area going for the bed, that's why we include the buckwheat. So, and those all winter kill. So if you didn't get a chance to do it this year, for next year you'll have that list ready to go. Let me just show you what it looks like to put those leaves on top and how thickly we do it. And again, I was just saying that you'll want to have something in place to hold those leaves down, because if you're like me, your area is pretty windy, and in windy areas, these leaves are going to be in your neighbor's yard or up against your fence and on the first windy day. So once you've gotten some precipitation going, some rain, some snow that are weighing these leaves down, then you don't have to worry about it as much. It's just when you first apply them, I would recommend using a tarp or that kind of thing to help hold them in place. So a layer, I would say, about this thick is going to be great for your garden bed. So it doesn't have to be crazy thick, but you do want to create a nice blanket. So something that looks like this. And these are actually our leaves from last year, so you can see they're already starting to mold really nicely and turn into this beautiful, what we call soil humus. And so there will still be some of this in place in the spring. Now, I leave my soaker hoses in place. I usually just bury them underneath the leaves, but you can remove them if you want. Okay, so we've got this in place. We're going to cover it with some kind of tarp or insect netting or mesh or one of those options in order to hold those in place. You could also use frost cloth. And that's going to help hold it in place. It's going to keep that moisture level. It's going to keep the temperature level even. And it's going to provide organic matter and food for the decomposers and the shredders. So in the spring, some of these leaves will still be in place. Don't expect that these are all going to be gone. Depending on how active your soil life is, a lot of them might be gone. A lot of them might still be in place. But what we're going to do in the spring is we're just going to scooch it aside. Okay, so let's say in the spring that you still have this much left on your soil. So what we would do is you simply scooch it aside, and you're going to plant right into that. So you don't have to, even depending on how thickly you did these leaves, you don't always even need extra mulch in the spring. Now, the downside of this is using this mulch might keep your soil temperatures cooler for a little bit longer in the spring, because we have a blanket on top of the soil. It's helping retain heat, yes, but it's also helping retain cold, okay? It's keeping the temperature more even. So you may run into that your soil temperatures stay cooler a little bit longer in the spring. So if you want to plant earlier in the spring, you might want to remove some of this leaf litter, put it aside, let the soil temperatures warm up for a week, and then you can use the leaves again as a mulch after you've planted and after the soil temperatures have warmed up a little bit. Okay, that was a lot of information I just threw at you guys in 30 minutes. If you have questions, I'm going to hang out here for a minute. If there's something that I didn't cover that you had questions on for fall, I hope that the undercropping concept was helpful for you, especially for next year. Undercropping has been a game changer for us in being able to cover crop and yet continue to grow things like our tomatoes, even a dahlia in garden beds. Again, it's trimming up those lower leaves and getting some access to the soil so that those seeds can germinate. It's totally fine for the cover crop to be growing while your other plants are growing, and that's a big paradigm shift. Do we sow any seeds, hardy annuals, in the fall? Yes and no. We sow ones that we expect to germinate in the spring. So bells of Ireland, larkspur are some. Back when we used to grow chocolate lace flower, we would do those in the fall, though those are invasive, so we don't plant those anymore. But yes, we'll occasionally will sow in the winter things that should germinate in early spring. But in general, I prefer not to do that because I find you have to leave your soil relatively bare in order for them to germinate at the right time. I just would rather put the effort into getting the soil healthy over winter and then planting in early spring. But there are things like native seeds that like that cold stratification period over the winter. Those you can definitely plant in the fall. But in general, we've had a little bit of trouble with overwintering young seedlings. We also have a lot of birds, and so that's always an issue because they eat the seeds that we put down. All right. Let's see, Laura, how do you hold down the leaf holding fabric? Oh, we just use staples. So we just use big staples, the 6-inch staples, these guys, and we just stick these right into the soil, and we use these to hold down whatever mesh we're going to use to hold down those leaves. So get the nice deep staples, not the shallow ones. These nice deep ones will hold that in place. If we know the soil has been sprayed, what is the best way to help it become more healthy? All of these practices that we talk about in the class, and especially that seasonal guide, are going to get you back to healthy soil. Now, there's exceptions to that, and we mentioned the PFAS issue with compost, and we do talk about that in the class, but this is why I do not like the no-dig principle for starting garden beds. And permaculture in general, there's been a big shift in people starting garden beds with a whole big pile of compost on top. In theory, that's a good idea if you're making all your own compost. Most of us don't make enough compost to be able to start our whole garden bed that way with a really nice deep, thick layer of compost that we've made at home. So most of us buy in compost in bulk. And those things can be treated with different chemicals like PFAS, which are forever chemicals. Those will never leave your soil. Once they are in your soil, they are there forever. This is why I don't like to use a lot of compost. I don't use a lot of purchased compost. And I don't like the no-dig principle because you start with cardboard and you layer 5 inches of compost on top, and who the heck knows what's in there. But all of these principles are going to help get you back to a healthier soil life. But there are certain times when chemicals that have been in your soil are just never going to leave. Now, if you're talking about spraying things like, you just said chemical, if it's been sprayed, I assume you mean with herbicide, maybe. If your soil has been sprayed with herbicide like Roundup has a very short half-life. I think it's 20 days. So after 20 days, the soil microbes actually break it down, and it shouldn't be existing in your soil any longer. So you don't have to worry about that. But all of these principles that we're talking about in the class of the regenerative gardening are going to get you toward that healthy soil, no matter what it's been treated with. Just existing store-bought planting mix in the soil negatively impacts soil health. Personally, I think yes. I would always rather work with native soil than purchased soil. And that's because of some of the issues that we've brought up. There is not a lot of transparency in the soil industry. They can label pretty much any soil as organic because technically it's organic matter. So they can call it organic, even if it's not certified organic. So what I always look for if I have to purchase soil in a bag is an OMRI certified, and that's OMRI, OMRI certified soil. And that's going to make sure that it doesn't have biosolids in it primarily that are going to contaminate your soil. So yes, there are some safe ones. Look for that OMRI certified label. First time with drip irrigation, I do, yes, blow it out at the end of before you get your first freeze, you'll want to blow out with a pressure, an air compressor, attach an air compressor to the end of your hose, take off all of your end caps. If you have end caps like I do, take these off, blow out your system, and then I leave them in place over winter underneath the mulch. Do we do more cover cropping or more? We do both. The question was, do we do more cover cropping or more compost leaves? It depends on the bed. For example, our dahlia beds, because we have to leave those in all the way through frost, we usually end up doing compost and leaf in those beds, and we try to do cover crop in everything else. And this is where rotation of your garden becomes important, right? Making sure that you're not planting the same thing in the same bed every year, so that at least once every 2 or 3 years, you get a cover crop in. If you don't get one in every year, it's not a huge deal, but I try to put something back into the soil at least every couple or 3 years. So make sure you're doing that rotation. In Colorado, if you haven't done a cover crop yet, you're going to apply some compost, use your broad fork to loosen, and then leaves with something on top. Exactly. Any recommendation for mitigation of puddling moths in apple trees? Buy disease-resistant apple trees and pest resistant apple trees. There's really not much that's like a healthy, harsh spray-less product for apple trees especially, which just tend to be very pest sensitive. And so we've just started transitioning. We grow quite a few Honeycrisp, but we've also started transitioning to some of the older varieties, which tend to do better and are more pest resistant. Like Macintosh is a great one that just doesn't seem to have the pest issues that some of the newer varieties do. So there's not a lot of great options, but there is the compost tea. You can always try using that. Some people say they have good results with compost tea and reduction of pests. And we do include how to make that compost tea in the class as well. All right. I think that's the end of our questions. So I'm expecting, guys, the class to be live that first week of November. We're basically just making finishing touches right now in some of the footage. And we're also finishing up the handouts that are going to go with the class. So come first week of November, it should be live. And if you guys have any questions in the meantime, please feel free to respond to the email that I sent out this morning. That's my direct email, and I'm always happy to help out. Thank you. Oh, Laura has one more question. Soil test says everything is fine, but watermelons are baseball size and tomatoes were puny. With heavy clay soil with thick compost, I would say 4 inches would be too much. It sounds like you're having a bit of a nitrogen deficiency. Or you could have just compacted soil. So I would try doing, I would say 4 inches would be too much. I would say maybe maximum 2 inches of compost and broad fork that in just to help lighten up the soil and get some organic matter down into it. That should also help with the compaction issue. But if you can next year, do a cover crop that includes those radishes because that's going to help break up heavy clay soil. All right, guys, I'm super excited for you guys all to join us on the journey to regenerative gardening. If you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me a message. Otherwise, thanks all for joining me. Have a beautiful, beautiful weekend. Thanks, everyone.